For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Paul John Spaulding. Joining me today is Amanda Glassner, Deputy Editor at Cybercrime Magazine. Amanda, thanks for joining me for another update episode.
Thanks for having me.
So we have a rather interesting topic to talk about here today, which is one of our podcasts that we produced recently with Silvia Semenzin as one of our guests. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. But the gist of it is that the internet is often portrayed as a neutral space, open and even democratic, a place full of possibilities. But for many women, the web is far from free. I'm reading that as something from our blog that we actually put out as an announcement that we did this podcast to highlight it. Amanda, why don't you tell me a bit about Silvia? What's going on? Why do we have this podcast? And just share any thoughts that you have.
So I think this is a really great example of a podcast topic that we don't always get to highlight, but it is definitely really important and not something that should be ignored. As you were saying before, Paul, the internet is often portrayed as a neutral space and sometimes even democratic. But for me and for a lot of other women, I think it is something that presents a lot of violence, silencing, threats, and sexism that are often disguised as humor or memes. And, I think as the internet continues to evolve, the line between entertainment and aggression is kind of blurred, which is something that Silvia highlights in her book and she talked about on the podcast. When Chris came to me with Silvia as a suggested guest, I kind of thought she was really an interesting person to bring on because her title is technically a digital sociologist. And I actually almost minored in sociology in college, but did not get the credits. But I always thought sociology was really interesting. So to think about it and to kind of get that perspective from someone who is a digital sociologist, I just think it adds a whole new layer to the conversation of women's safety on the internet. And like I said, I just think it's really critical that we start talking about this a little bit more going forward.
So, yes, we've had Silvia on as a guest. If anyone wants to listen to that podcast, they can just Google Cybercrime Magazine, go to our podcast and find it there. Also, Silvia's book that she wrote on the topic is titled Internet is Not a Safe Place for Women. But not to be too on the nose here, Amanda, you are a woman. You exist on the internet just like 99% of other people on planet Earth. When you were listening to this episode that Heather hosted, did you kind of resonate with a lot of the stuff that they were discussing? Just what were your thoughts about that?
There is a lot of relevance to what Silvia talks about in her book, and a lot of it is unfortunately relatable, I would say, probably not just for myself, but for a lot of women. I think even just in society, there's a level of like physical safety that comes with being a woman, and it definitely translates across the internet. It's just the extra importance to protect yourself, just to kind of go out of your way and take extra steps where needed to ensure your safety. And I think I go out, I travel a lot by myself. And I think the internet for me, I would view as a less safe space than kind of if I'm walking down the street in Manhattan alone. But there are important steps you can take to stay protected. And Silvia even kind of highlighted that the online environment today is a little bit more pro cyber violence against women just because it is so male dominated.
It is kind of interesting because I feel a traditional mindset, if we go back pre-internet age, is, and I hope this is an okay comparison in a different sense, but something like catcalling, at least today, at least for me, people I know, that's not perceived as acceptable or okay to do. It's definitely frowned upon, I feel, in society, at least I hope it is. But the internet is a space where a form of that can go further because people, I think, when they're behind their keyboard, they feel a sense of immunity or they're on their phones. There's almost an anonymity to being online in a way that could make these types of, I hate to say it, prevalent behaviors even worse. Is that kind of how Silvia frames it? I'm just trying to get a perspective for, look, I don't want to spoil the podcast episode, but I'm just trying to get a deeper perspective on this.
Yeah, not to spoil the podcast episode, as you were saying, but while I was listening and hearing what Silvia had to say, it reminded me of just something that I think I always thought was common, but I think for a lot of women, like something that I try to do now is when like I order an Uber or I order like Uber Eats, I'll use a male name just so that I'm not like, when I put the order in, I'm not putting myself out there as like a woman alone taking an Uber, which I think takes the like some people would hear that and say, "Oh, she's stupid." You know what I mean? That's not necessary. But I think just hearing everything Silvia had to say, it kind of reiterated the importance of doing something like that, just to, you never know who's on the other side of the internet, really. So unfortunately, today there are a lot more threats on the internet than there were maybe 10, 20 years ago. But yeah, I don't want to get too into the podcast. I don't want to spoil anything. So I would really just encourage our listeners to find the episode, hear what Silvia has to say, kind of really think about it. And not just for women. I would encourage men too to listen.
Amanda, thanks for joining me, even though it's a tougher topic to discuss today.
Of course, happy to be here.
To follow all of our media, go to cybercrimemagazine.com.